There are stories that begin with human beings, and then there are stories that begin before humanity, before cities, before temples, before kings, before the first monuments rose from the earth, before memory hardened into history, before the human world knew how to write its own name into stone. This is one of those stories. According to this chronicle, the true beginning of civilization does not start on Earth. It starts elsewhere, on another world, a world called Nibiru. And from the condition of that world comes everything that follows: the coming of the Anunnaki, the search for gold, the burden of labour, the shaping of humanity, the rise of order and civilization, and the great flood that divides the ages. To understand this story, it helps to move through it slowly, not as a list of strange names, not as disconnected pieces of myth, but as one continuous account. A world in danger, a mission to Earth, a crisis of labour, a new species created under necessity, a species that begins as function, then becomes something more, a catastrophe that breaks memory, and the long human age that follows. This is the Anunnaki Chronicle, and in its own telling, the story begins not with man, but with need. Nibiru is described as the home of the Anunnaki. It is presented as an old world, a world of knowledge, hierarchy, power, and advanced capability. A civilization exists there long before humanity takes shape on Earth. A civilization ordered enough to act with purpose, knowledgeable enough to understand what its world requires, powerful enough to cross the distance between worlds in search of it. But Nibiru is not shown as secure. It is shown as threatened. Its atmosphere is weakening. Its protective balance is failing. The world itself stands in danger of decline unless something can be done to restore its stability. This is the first principle of the Chronicle. Before there is human history, there is planetary crisis. Before there are civilizations on Earth, there is necessity somewhere else. And that necessity gives Earth its importance. Because according to the story, the answer to Nibiru's problem is gold. In this account, gold is not simply precious because it is rare or beautiful. It is not merely a symbol of wealth. It is not merely royal metal, ornament, or treasure. It is a substance of practical and planetary significance. A material whose properties can be used to preserve, repair, or shield the atmosphere of Nibiru. That is why another world turns its attention toward Earth. Earth is significant because it contains what is needed. Gold exists here in abundance, hidden in mountains, buried in deep stone, carried in riverbeds, locked inside the raw body of the planet. And so Earth becomes, in the earlier stage of the story, not the centre of the cosmos, but a source, a resource world, a place whose buried wealth becomes essential to the survival of another civilization. That is why the Anunnaki come. They do not arrive as lost wanderers. They do not drift here without intention. They come under purpose, or with structure, with objective, with mission, and from the moment they arrive, the Earth changes, the land is entered, the hidden veins of the planet are opened, the mountains, plains, and deep places of the Earth become part of a larger operation. The extraction of gold begins. This is the first age of the Chronicle, the age of arrival and labour. It's important to dwell on that word for a moment, labour. Because even in a story about advanced beings, distant worlds, and the shaping of life itself, one of the central forces is still work. The task must be done, the material must be gathered, the mission depends on effort, and effort, once prolonged, becomes burden. The Anunnaki are powerful, but they are not free from necessity. They may have knowledge beyond human measure, but they still require action in the material world. They must mine. They must extract, they must carry out the difficult process of drawing from Earth what Nibiru needs in order to survive, and over time the burden becomes too great. This is one of the first great turning points in the story. The work grows exhausting, the strain intensifies. Those performing the labour begin to resist it. They grow weary of endless extraction, weary of serving inside a task that does not end. The mission cannot simply be abandoned. Nibiru still needs gold. The need that brought the Anunnaki here has not disappeared, but the existing order of labour begins to fail, and that failure gives rise to one of the most consequential questions in the whole legend. How can the work continue? How can the burden be transferred? How can the mission be sustained without forcing the Anunnaki themselves to remain forever bound to the hardest labour of the earth? That question changes everything. Because once the answer to a crisis of labour becomes creation, the future of Earth is permanently altered. This is where Enki enters the chronicle in full importance. Among the Anunnaki, Enki is presented as a being of extraordinary intelligence. He is associated with knowledge, with insight, with the understanding of systems, with the ability to shape, alter, and redesign what already exists. He is not described as a figure of brute force alone. He's the one who understands process, the one who sees possibility inside existing forms, the one who can look at a problem and imagine a new order rather than simply endure the old one. So when labour becomes unbearable, Enki provides the answer. And his answer is biological. Earth already contains life. This is important in the logic of the story. The planet is not empty. It already holds primitive forms, early creatures, the beginnings of something living and adaptable. Enki does not create from emptiness. He works with what Earth already offers. He studies it, he alters it, he elevates it, he shapes it into something new, and from that transformation comes humanity. This is the central act of creation in the Anunnaki Chronicle. Humanity is not introduced first as a species of sovereign rulers, not as philosophers, not as builders of great monuments, not as free beings placed into a garden of ease. Humanity first appears as a functional answer to necessity, a species designed for labour, a created workforce, a being made to perform the difficult work that the Anunnaki themselves no longer wish to endure. That gives the human origin in this story a very particular character. Humans are brought into existence under pressure. They are made because a system requires them, because another world depends on Earth's resources, and the extraction of those resources demands workers. This is why labour stands so near the beginning of human existence in the Chronicle. Work is not a later condition. It is part of the purpose of humanity's design. And because of that, the story also explains something else. Hierarchy. Humans are created inside an order that already exists. The system is older than they are. The mission is older than they are. The needs of Nibiru, the authority of the Anunnaki, and the structure of labour all precede humanity. So when humans enter the story, they do not enter as the first order on Earth. They enter as beings placed inside a larger order. That is why the early human role is narrow. To serve, to labour, to function within a system, to carry a burden. Yet almost immediately the story begins moving towards something more complicated. Because what is created for one purpose does not always remain confined to that purpose. This is one of the deepest currents in the whole chronicle. Humanity begins as utility, but it does not remain utility. The species learns. It adapts. It survives and reproduces. It begins to form continuity, and that continuity changes the meaning of everything. At first, a worker is simply a worker, an instrument of function, a created answer to a practical problem. But once that worker becomes a species, the situation changes. Once a created being can reproduce, accumulate experience, and begin to form memory across generations, it is no longer only an instrument. It becomes a developing force in the world. This is where Enki's role changes again. He is no longer only the creator of humanity. He becomes the one who sees in humanity more than the immediate purpose for which it was made. He sees possibility for awareness, for knowledge, for organization, for continuity, for civilization. This recognition is one of the great turning points in the legend, because a workforce that remains simple can be controlled. A workforce that begins to develop can become something far more difficult to contain. A species that only obeys is one thing. A species that remembers, learns, and grows in awareness is another. And so a deeper tension enters the story. What exactly is humanity for? Only labour? Only service? only the continuation of the mission that brought the Anunnaki to Earth, or something larger? This question lingers beneath everything that follows, and it is one of the reasons Enki becomes such a central figure in the chronicle. He is not only the one who makes humanity possible, he is the one who sees that what has been made may exceed the first purpose for which it was created. This brings us to one of the great themes of the story: knowledge. In the Anunnaki chronicle, knowledge is never a neutral thing. Knowledge changes hierarchy. Knowledge changes power. Knowledge changes the relationship between creator and creation. As long as humanity remains a simple labor force, the order is clear. The Anunnaki command, humans serve, the mission continues. But once humanity begins to develop mind, memory, and continuity, the order is no longer so simple. Because now the created beings are not only working, they are becoming. And becoming leads naturally to civilization. This is one of the most important transitions in the story. The species created to solve a practical problem becomes the species of settlement, structure, and human history. At first, humans labor under instruction. Later, they organize themselves. They gather into patterns. They sustain continuity across time. They develop order. And with order comes the beginning of civilization. Within the logic of this chronicle, civilization does not appear from nowhere. It grows out of the same capacities that made humanity useful for labor in the first place. The ability to endure, the ability to obey pattern, the ability to function within structure. These same capacities later become the basis of cities, systems, law, hierarchy, and culture. That is one of the deepest implications of the legend. The human race is not only a created workforce, it is a civilization-bearing species. And once that becomes visible, the original relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity starts to change. Because a workforce can be managed, a developing civilization cannot be managed so easily. As humanity grows, the species multiplies, its numbers increase, its presence spreads, its structures deepen. The narrow purpose for which it was designed begins to widen into something broader and more powerful, and that creates instability. The original frame can no longer contain what humanity is becoming. This is where the story begins moving toward catastrophe, not because the original purpose disappears, but because the created species has grown beyond it. The tension becomes too great, and the great dividing event approaches, the flood. The flood is not a minor incident in the Anunnaki chronicle. It is one of the central acts of the entire story. It divides the first age from the second. Before the flood, there is direct shaping. Before the flood, the great species still exists close to the age of its makers. Before the flood, continuity has not yet broken. After the flood, everything changes. Memory fractures. Knowledge fragments. What survives no longer survives intact. That is why the flood is not simply destruction in this story. It is rupture. It marks the breaking of the First World Order. Humanity's growth, expansion, and instability can no longer remain contained inside the structure that first created it. And so catastrophe arrives on a world-shaping scale. But not everything is lost. Because once again, Enki stands at the center of the turning point. If Enki is the creator at the beginning of the human story, he becomes the preserver at its moment of greatest danger. This is one of the most important developments in his role. He's no longer only the one who solved the problem of labor by creating a new species. He is the one who ensures that species survives when the first age collapses. He protects continuity. He preserves the future. He makes it possible for humanity to pass into the next world rather than vanish in the destruction of the first. This changes the emotional meaning of the entire story. To create a species for labor is one thing. To preserve that species through catastrophe is another. It means humanity has become more than utility, more than solution, more than workforce. It has become something worth carrying forward. That is why the flood holds two meanings at once. It is destruction and it is preservation. It is the end of the first age and the beginning of the second. When the flood passes, the world that remains is not the same as the world that came before. The first age is gone, the direct age has ended, the old structures have fractured, but their consequences remain. This is where the story enters one of its most powerful and atmospheric phases, the Age of Fragments. After the flood, knowledge no longer survives in full clarity. What remains is memory, broken memory, scattered memory, fragments of a deeper past preserved in names, myths, sacred stories, and the inherited sense that something greater stood at the beginning of civilization. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire Anunnaki chronicle. Civilization does not arise from complete ignorance. It arises from damaged remembrance. Human beings continue into the later world carrying traces of the first age. The old truths remain, but only in pieces. The names endure: Nibiru, the Anunnaki, Enki, the flood, the hidden beginning of human order. And so later civilization becomes, in the logic of the story, the afterlife of the first intervention. Cities rise, but they rise on inherited ground. Kings rule, but kingship echoes older structures of authority. Temples stand, but temples preserve memory of powers and ages that human beings no longer fully understand. This gives the chronicle its deep feeling of hidden inheritance. The world of man is not the original world, it is the later world. A world shaped by what came before it. A world built upon structures, disruptions, and memories older than civilization itself. And that is why the story feels so complete. It explains not only how humanity comes into existence, it explains why civilization carries the shapes it does, why hierarchy seems ancient, why labor is foundational, why the gods are remembered, why flood memory survives, why ancient order feels both familiar and mysterious. All of these are part of one structure: a threatened world, a mission of extraction, a crisis of labor, the creation of humanity, the development of civilization, the flood, the breaking of the first age, and the rise of later human history from fragments of that shattered beginning. To see the chronicle clearly, it helps to gather its structure in full. First, there is Nibiru, a world in danger, a world whose future depends on restoring its atmosphere. Second, there is gold, the resource that makes Earth essential. Third, there is the arrival of the Anunnaki, an organized civilization crossing worlds under necessity. Fourth, there is labor, the difficult work of mining and extraction that sustains the mission. Fifth, there is the burden of that labor, the growing strain that makes the old order unstable. Sixth, there is Enki's intervention, the shaping of a new species from the life already present on Earth. Seventh, there is humanity, created under necessity, designed for labor, placed inside a hierarchy older than itself. Eighth, there is development. The created species begins to learn, reproduce, organize, and move beyond its first function. Ninth, there is civilization. Humanity becomes more than workforce, it becomes historical. 10th, there is tension. The species exceeds the frame in which it was first designed. 11th, there is the flood, the catastrophe that divides the first age from the second. 12th, there is preservation. Enki protects continuity and ensures that humanity survives. And 13th, there is the Age of Fragments. Civilization rises afterward, carrying damaged memory of the First World Order. This is the chronicle in its long form, and when told in sequence, each part leads naturally to the next. That is why it has such narrative force. Nibiru creates the need, gold creates the mission, labor creates the crisis, Enki creates humanity, humanity creates development, development creates tension, tension creates catastrophe, catastrophe creates fragments, fragments create civilization. It is a complete cycle, and at the center of almost every major threshold stands Enki. This is why he remains the defining intelligence of the story. He is the one who turns necessity into form. the one who sees that life can be altered, the one who understands that a problem in one order can be answered by transforming another, the one who recognizes more in humanity than its first function, and the one who carries that species through the breaking of the first age. To understand Enki in the Chronicle is to understand the story as a sequence of transformations. A crisis becomes a mission becomes labor becomes creation becomes humanity becomes civilization, catastrophe becomes memory. This movement is the heart of the legend. It is also what gives the human condition its special place inside the story. Humanity is not fully of one world, it is of Earth, but altered by intelligence beyond Earth. It is made for labour, but capable of growth beyond labour. It is shaped inside hierarchy, but carries the potential for memory, order, and self-awareness. This makes humanity a bridge species in the Chronicle, a species of mixed condition. That is why human life feels divided inside the logic of the story. Humans are tied to work, yet never satisfied by work alone. They organise themselves into systems, yet long for meanings greater than those systems. They remember the gods, they preserve the names, they search ancient memory for the hidden beginning of their own existence. Within the story, none of this is accidental. It follows from origin. Humanity begins inside necessity, but it can never remain only necessity. That is one of the deepest meanings of the Chronicle. The species is designed for function, but not fixed forever within function. It carries something more: potential, awareness, continuity, the ability to become historical. And that is why the human story in this legend does not end with creation. It only begins there, because once humanity exists, the entire later history of civilization becomes part of the original unfolding. Every city, every law, every labour system, every temple, every memory of divine order, every attempt to preserve or interpret the ancient past, all of it belongs to the afterlife of the first intervention. That is why memory matters so much in the story, because memory is what remains strong enough to point backward, but broken enough to require interpretation. The earliest age survives only in fragments, and yet those fragments are enough to shape all that comes after. This gives the legend its sense of depth. The visible world is never just the visible world, it is the later layer of a much older structure. The human age is never simply the human age, it is the continuation of a world already altered by another civilization, another need, another order. And this is where the Chronicle becomes more than origin story, it becomes explanation. Why do humans labour? Because labour stands near the beginning of their purpose. Why do humans build hierarchy? Because they are born inside hierarchy. Why does civilization feel ancient even at its first appearance? Because it rises from damaged remembrance rather than total ignorance. Why do the gods endure in memory? Because the first age was shaped under the presence of beings greater than humanity itself. Why does the flood matter so much? Because it divides direct knowledge from inherited fragments. All of these questions answer one another. That is why the story has such staying power. It creates a total world, and in that total world nothing is isolated. The condition of Nibiru connects to the resources of Earth. The resources of Earth connect to labour. Labour connects to creation. Creation connects to human order. Human order connects to growth. Growth connects to catastrophe. Catastrophe connects to memory. Memory connects to civilization. Each part depends on what came before it, and each part alters what comes after it. That is why the Anunnaki Chronicle can be told as a hidden history of everything. Not because it explains one event, but because it claims to explain the structure beneath all events, the burden of work, the persistence of hierarchy, the rise of order, the recurrence of divine memory, the fracture between ancient truth and later civilization. All of these become part of one sequence. And once that sequence is understood, the whole legend becomes easier to inhabit. One can imagine the first age, the Earth still unclaimed by human civilization, the Anunnaki arriving under the pressure of necessity, the land opened for gold. The burden of labour growing heavier with time, Enki studying the life already present on Earth. Then the act of transformation, the shaping of a new species, the first human beings entering existence under purpose, the long age in which that species works, survives, multiplies, and begins to become more than its first design intended. Then the expansion, the tension, the growth that no longer fits neatly inside the original frame. Then the flood, the great rupture, the destruction that ends one age but not the story itself. And after that, the surviving world, the age of fragments, cities rising from damaged memory, temples preserving incomplete truths, kings ruling inside structures older than they know, human civilization carrying the hidden imprint of its first beginning. That is the full emotional arc of the chronicle. And perhaps that is why it feels so large, because it says that humanity is never small. Even at the moment of its creation, it is tied to another world, to another crisis, to another intelligence, to a purpose larger than itself. And even after catastrophe, humanity continues not as a blank slate but as inherited consequence. The species carries the weight of what formed it. That gives the chronicle one of its most haunting ideas. To be human is to live inside a forgotten inheritance, to labour inside systems older than memory, to carry within oneself both earth and intervention, function and awareness, service and the possibility of becoming more than service, and to spend history in one form or another trying to remember the beginning. That is why the names endure. Nibiru, the Anunnaki, Enki, Golda, the flood, the first age, the second age, the hidden origin of civilization. Taken together, they form one long narrative. A world in danger, a mission to Earth, a burden of labour, a created species, a growing civilization, a great rupture, and the long human age that follows in the shadow of what came before. So when the story reaches its final shape, one truth remains above all others. Humanity in this chronicle is not only made, it is carried forward, created under necessity, placed inside hierarchy, given function, then altered by growth, memory, and catastrophe into something larger than its first purpose. This is the hidden grandeur of the Anunnaki story. The creators needed labour, but the result was history. The mission required workers, but the outcome was civilization. The crisis on Nibiru led not only to extraction on Earth, but to the shaping of a race capable of building worlds of its own. That race survives the flood. It inherits fragments of the first age. And from those fragments, all later human order rises. That is why the chronicle lingers in the mind, because it offers more than a beginning. It offers a condition, a way of understanding labour, hierarchy, memory, and civilization as parts of one deep inheritance. It says that beneath the visible human world lies an older pattern, a pattern formed in another world's crisis, a pattern carried across worlds through gold, labour, creation, catastrophe, and survival. And it says that civilization itself is not the first world, only the later world, the world after rupture, the world after fragments, the world that remembers only enough to know that something immense once stood at the beginning. So let the final sequence remain simple. Nibiru was threatened, gold was needed, the Anunnaki came to Earth, the labour became too great, Enki shaped humanity, humanity grew beyond labour, the flood divided the ages, Enki preserved the future, and civilization rose from fragments, carrying forward the broken memory of the First World Order. That is the chronicle from beginning to end, not as scattered pieces, but as one long unfolding, a crisis on another world, a mission to Earth, a species created under necessity, a great rupture, a damaged inheritance, and the long human story that followed. In the end, that may be why the legend continues to hold its power. because it describes human beings as creatures of tension, born inside function, drawn beyond function, made under order, yet always reaching toward memory, always trying to understand the hidden shape of what formed them, always building civilizations above a foundation they only partly remember, and always, somewhere beneath the structures of the visible world, carrying the echo of another beginning. A beginning in which the earth mattered before it was human. A beginning in which gold drew the attention of another world. A beginning in which labour created the need for life to be reshaped. A beginning in which Enki looked upon what already lived here and saw not only what it was, but what it could become. From that act came humanity. From humanity came civilization. From catastrophe came fragments. And from fragments came the long inheritance of memory, order, and history. That is the hidden beginning. That is the Anunnaki chronicle. And that is the story carried forward into the human age.